everyone, and thank you for joining us for a webinar on the New World Order, Implications of the Rising U.S.-China Friction. I'm Yumiko Ono, and I'm editor of news operations in APAC at the Wall Street Journal based in Singapore. I wanted to thank INSEAD for hosting the event and for inviting us to participate. I'm so excited today to have so many people from all over the world join us for this event. This is an extremely timely topic, and we'll be discussing this today. So much has happened in both the US and China in just the past few weeks, including today. So I would now like to introduce the two panelists. We have Michael Witt. He's the Senior Affiliate Professor of Strategy and International Business at INSEAD in Singapore. His expertise is on international business and global strategy, and he has a special interest in geopolitics and business, including a topic that we'll be focusing on today, which is decoupling and deglobalization. We also have Josh Chin. He's the Deputy Bureau Chief at the Wall Street Journal's China Bureau, and he is responsible for politics and general news. Before this role, Josh spent 6 years as a politics reporter in China, and he's the co-author of the book Surveillance State: Inside China's Quest to Launch a New Era of Social Control that just came out in September, and he is now based in Seoul. So I'd like to welcome the two panelists. Let's see. Okay, so I would like to start by asking the two panelists to give us a personal anecdote about the recent state of US-China relations that's had a particular impact on you. And Michael, I'm going to start with you.
Yes, so I've been thinking quite a lot about this. Thank you very much, Yumiko, and thank you everybody for coming. And the anecdote I would like to share is actually my experience with teaching the Communist Party at INSEAD. So for 3 years running from 2014 through 2016, I was the program director of a program that was training actually top executives of state-owned enterprises. And if you know a little bit about China, of course, people will be aware that you don't get to the top of a state-owned enterprise unless you are a high-ranking party official. And this relates to this topic because in the span of just 3 years, from 2014 to 2016, it was remarkable how bad actually here the relationship, even the learning environment actually got. 2014, this was really kind of the tail end of Hu Jintao's time. And we had very open, free-flowing discussions. The following year, this was entering the era of Xi Jinping. Things were already fairly quiet. And then by 2016, we actually later found out that the participants had been explicitly instructed to make sure not to friend anybody from INSEAD on WeChat.
Oh.
And the classroom discussion actually had become very, very quiet. And this actually was the end then of this particular journey, because we also felt that it actually made no sense to engage further if you cannot have an open discussion, the kind that we actually like to have at INSEAD. So to me, it's interesting how you actually saw kind of the real life deterioration rapidly reflected in the classroom and in relations that we actually had with Chinese companies.
And you've seen that change starting already back in 2016. That's very interesting.
15, it started to become visible. By 2016, it was absolutely clear that these are probably not different from the people in 2014, but they're very smart. What I can say is these people were all very, very smart. And of course, they respond to the incentives that they are given. And if the incentives in the environment changes, they will obviously adapt to that. To the point that having a classroom discussion no longer seemed very sensible.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Michael. Very interesting. And Josh, what is your anecdote?
Well, my anecdote is one you are well familiar with, Yumiko. And this one starts actually in early 2020, when I had just come back from book leave to the Beijing bureau, and I had just taken up a new position as the deputy bureau chief, my current position, and it was around this time the Wall Street Journal opinion page, which is completely separate from the news operation, published an opinion column about the pandemic, which had just started in China. And the headline on that column, it referred to China as the sick man of Asia, which was which is a phrase that in China is incredibly sensitive. It kind of dates back to China's century of humiliation when a lot of European powers and Western powers referred to it as the sick man of Asia, and it got a fair amount of attention. It also got a lot of that attention was fanned by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which sort of made a point of mentioning it several times in press briefings. Which was interesting because at the time the Wall Street Journal was blocked, and is still blocked in China. So I don't think many Chinese people would have read that headline had it not been for the foreign ministry raising it. But it sort of grew and grew into a sort of minor storm in China, and then in early February. Our bureau chief was called into the foreign ministry. It was actually the day that his visa was supposed to be renewed. And I went in with him because he was new to the job. And so we went in together. The foreign ministry wouldn't let me into the meeting. They only let our bureau chief in, and he came out with his face sort of very pale. And I just joked. I said, "What did they kick you out?" And he turned to me and he said, "No, they kicked you out."
Oh, God.
And it was me and two of my colleagues, two other Wall Street Journal reporters who the foreign ministry had decided to expel, ostensibly over this the headline on this opinion column. What transpired after that was basically a media war that resulted in journalists, a huge number of journalists, Chinese journalists in the U.S. being kicked out of the U.S., and then another huge group of American reporters being kicked out of China for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and for the Wall Street Journal. So all of the Americans for those three news organizations essentially were kicked out of China, and it was such a shocking development. It was the first time that since the Mao era, at least, that China had expelled multiple reporters from the same news organization. They hadn't really formally expelled any reporters at all since the 1990s. And I thought it was a real, after I sort of had time to process it, it just struck me as this real sign of Beijing's, it signaled Beijing's sort of new relationship with the democratic world, especially with the Western world, and especially the Wall Street Journal was a very early presence in China, and I think it was welcomed in part because it was seen as reporting on business, and China was open for business, in the 1980s, 70s, and 80s when Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal started there, and so they wanted Western media there to sort of calm the fears of or the doubts of Western investors and attract more investment to China. And when we got expelled, it just sort of felt like a sign to me that era was over. That their priorities had shifted. The priorities were no longer about interacting or attracting interaction with the Western world as so much as they were about protecting China's interests and security and reputation.
And meanwhile, while you were talking, there was a question from the audience about what was the name of the title of your book. So I'll say it once more: Surveillance State, Inside China's Quest to Launch a New Era of Social Control. And it's written by Josh and a reporter, Lisa Lin. So thank you for the question. And my gosh, so both of you have very personal anecdotes that really show how things are changing between the US and China. And it doesn't seem to be in a good way. It seems to really show how tensions are rising. Now, I want to start with questions on the economy, between the economic relationship between the US and China. Michael, I'll start with you, and you're an expert on decoupling. Could you catch us up on this decoupling trend? To what extent will the US and Chinese economies decouple? And is there such a thing as decoupling to start with?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Yumiko, for that, because there's a lot of kind of confusion about this particular question here. And here I can't help but be a professor for like a couple of minutes and show some slides, right? So I prepared a couple of slides, and
okay.
We always teach even at the undergraduate level, one of the things you're taught is start with definitions. And it turns out actually a lot of the discussion that we are having about decoupling and deglobalization is actually confused because people don't define what they mean by these terms. So allow me just perhaps, to kind of say what they actually mean in academic language. And I have to say, to my embarrassment, that not even all of my academic colleagues really, who actually work on these questions, properly do this. So deglobalization doesn't mean that all of a sudden all international business stops. Deglobalization just means there's going to be less over time, right? Economic. So the process of weakening interdependence among nations, if we just apply this to the economy, it basically just means they interact economically less with each other. For deglobalization, the level of analysis is the world. Decoupling is a very similar process. It's basically the process of weakening interdependence between two nations or blocks of nations. In other words, they deal relatively less with each other. So interdependence means, I rely on you to get something that I need, and you rely on me to get something that you need, such as exports, right? Which basically means, okay, you need me for products, and similarly, I need you for products, so we trade. I need you for investment, and vice versa. Those are interdependence. And if actually over time these levels decline, then we are in a process called decoupling. So decoupling doesn't mean nothing happens anymore. This would be a fully decoupled state. Decoupling fundamentally just means we see an attenuation over time.
Okay, so even at the end of the decoupling, there's still some interaction. Is that correct?
Could be. So decoupling, so essentially here, a lot of the discussions in particular in Europe has been around the ideas like decoupling is being treated as if it meant that you would not deal at all with China anymore. That's not the point. So that is, of course, absurd, right? It could happen, but even we're not fully decoupled from North Korea either. So decoupling fundamentally just means we're relying less on each other.
Okay.
And I just want to show you maybe, what the data are. And first of all, for the audience, if you guys are really curious, here's a paper we've just published. It's available for free. So you can quickly scan this QR code and you will see things about, detailed statistics, drivers, predictions about decoupling patterns and stuff like that.
Okay, and lots of charts, I gather.
and a few charts, right? So let me first of all show you why there's so much confusion here. And this is actually a wonderful illustration of how not to do it, and was provided courtesy of McKinsey. It's the Global Institute. I have a lot of respect to the Global Institute, but this one is basically just plain wrong. So on the 15th of November, they published a report about globalization, and you see, among others, these two charts here. One is about trade, and the other one is about capital. And what you can see here is that essentially, those numbers keep going up. And this is taken as evidence that actually, globalization is continuing. Well, no, right? Because number one, trade numbers are in nominal terms. These numbers are not even adjusted for inflation. So at a minimum, you have to actually adjust for inflation. But more importantly, the question of globalization doesn't mean we trade more and more. Globalization essentially asks, relative to what my economy already has, how much do I rely on you? Remember, it's defined as interdependence. So you need to divide by GDP, and they're not doing that. And it's exactly the same problem here with capital, right? These are essentially, these are essentially trillions. So this is just nominal numbers. They are not inflation adjusted, at least not that I'm aware of. And they are not standardized by how big the economy is. If I get $1 trillion in foreign investments, but I'm a $20 trillion economy, that is very different from if I'm a $2 trillion economy and I get $1 trillion. So these things are basically just plain wrong. Right?
Okay.
This is not how it should be done. And if you then do it properly, this is unfortunately what it looks like. And I'm just showing you because I don't want to bore people too much with all kinds of figures. But this is foreign direct investment over time in the world, and it's divided by GDP, by world GDP. Why? Because again, the question is, relative to how much these countries actually already produce, how much are they actually relying on each other? And what you can see is that in general, we have been in a phase of deglobalization since 2008. Right? There's always some ups and downs. That's normal. But basically, what we're seeing here is we meet the definition of declining levels. Right? There's a process here where this is shrinking. Trade numbers are more resilient. Why? Because they reflect supply chain decisions that were made a long time ago. This to me is actually the most meaningful number because it shows you what companies think really the prospects are abroad. If you don't think that you're going to benefit much from doing something somewhere else, you're not going to plunk down a lot of money. And that's basically what we're seeing here. They keep investing, by the way, in their own economy. So it's not that investment itself has shrunk. It's just investment abroad has.
Right. Okay. Okay. And okay.
For
So,
China
okay.
and the
This
US,
is
this
what I
is
was getting
basically
to.
the same
Yes.
picture. Yeah. And you can see here, and this is maybe a bit unused to people, but fundamentally here, this is flows, investment flows from the US to China. And this is investment flows from China to the US. Okay, so fundamentally, this is divided. So the money basically that's flowing in divided by the GDP of the host. Translation, to what extent is the host country, the receiving country, really relying on that money? Again, interdependence means I need you. And you can see that actually the high point for China needing or relying on US money was in 2005. And it's declined since. We see a little bit of a kind of counter movement here from China to the US. This has something to do with a strategy called springboarding, where the idea is if you're an emerging market company and you want to kind of get to the top of the world quickly, one way to do that is actually to acquire companies abroad in order to absorb their capabilities. So you learn that way. And then, of course, 2016, we all know what happened. The Donald came along, and of course, things basically also heated up because Xi Jinping, essentially, it became clear that he would be staying for a lifetime. And you can see that it has dropped precipitously since. So you will see a similar kind of development for trade. This is basically the same thing for trade. And again, you can see here, 2005 high point for China, and then actually for the high point for the United States, benefiting from exports to China was 2014. This decline down there doesn't look that big, simply because obviously there's a scale effect here. The other number is very, very large.
So we do see that it's going down and down. Now your charts end at 2020.
Yeah.
Looking at the future, do you see the same trend continuing and continuing? So
maybe to focus on decoupling, right? Because the topic of today is China and the US, right? So we believe actually it's entirely likely for three reasons, right? Two actually very important. The first one is actually number one, political friction between China and the United States. The second reason is that in our reading, China is becoming less and less attractive for American companies to engage in. Right? Maybe the inverse is not true. United States is politically less attractive to Chinese firms, but probably economically not that much less attractive than it was, let's say, 10 years ago. And of course, there's also a role of kind of interesting new technologies that for the first time in history may actually make it easier to, or may actually work against globalization. Usually technology enables globalization. Usually technology enables interdependence. But now things such as local manufacturing, 3D printing, and so on and so forth may actually enable companies to bring things back that in the past were most sensibly produced abroad, including, of course, in the workshop of the world in China.
Okay, so you think that for those reasons, it's going to continue to decline. Thank you for that. And I also want to talk about COVID and what implications that has on decoupling. And Josh, catch us up on what happened today, because the Chinese government did make an announcement about this. And then I want to continue with, what has been the effect of zero COVID on decoupling?
Yeah, sure. So China today, the National Health Commission in China had a press conference where they announced a raft of new easing measures. Chiefly, they've scrapped a lot of the requirements for testing for Chinese people to move around in public or to go between provinces. And they've also ordered local governments to shorten quarantines to the minimum level necessary, so 5 days, and a few other measures that, and of course, the really important context in all of this is that it comes really shortly after some truly unprecedented, or at least extremely rare, nationwide protests against the COVID policy that were quite striking, and so there's a lot of debate about what all of this means. China was moving in this direction already, even before the protests. They and a lot of that is because of economic pressure. China's economy has China's economic growth has cratered in the COVID era, particularly in the last year, when China has stuck to its sort of zero tolerance COVID policies while the rest of the world is opening up. It's been incredibly difficult for business people, foreign business people to travel there, for Chinese people to travel out. Internally, the consumption, the consumer economy in China has really suffered, and so the economy is definitely a major motivating factor, and the party is saying seems to now, between economic pressure and the protests, be moving faster to open up somewhat. It's still, but these are still really incremental steps. There's still a lot of danger for China to just throw open the doors. They're not really vaccinated. The healthcare system is also really struggling. So it's still going to take a while. I think most experts think for China to actually emerge fully from zero COVID, but it's certainly sort of signaled issued a really important signal today that it intends to move in that direction.
Okay. Let's also talk a little bit about what happens next in this decoupling trend. The US has recently imposed tough restrictions on chip exports to China, and that's also leading to higher tension. So what do you think will happen next? Is China going to retaliate? Will there be more restrictions? Michael, what are your thoughts on this?
So first of all, I think that's very, very important to point to these restrictions that came in early October, right? So fundamentally, we've seen a number of additions to various lists in the United States that effectively actually mean, first of all, that more companies getting the Huawei treatment, but actually people who have looked at the impact of this whole thing are saying actually the entire Chinese economy is getting the Huawei treatment. So if you look at the details of the measures, you will actually see that effectively the United States is trying to cut off China from any advanced semiconductor technology. And actually even people were saying even technology that is 3 or 4 years old. So very, very clearly, this has actually ratcheted up the pressure on China very, very considerably. I honestly don't think China can really do much to retaliate. In a sense, basically, the technology flow is in one particular way, and here the United States has leverage. Would I expect further measures in the future? The answer is, well, it depends a little bit, whether you expect conflict or harmony to prevail between China and the United States. And basically all the major theories of international relations, which means theories of how states get along with each other or don't, but basically all are predicting that we're going to have stormy weather for the years to come. It would be astonishing if the United States actually then did not take further measures. And I should perhaps close by saying, one of the things, that is hard to believe that it actually happened, but, there's actually a consensus in Washington on something. And that is essentially, that basically China needs to be contained. And for that reason, I expect that if anything, actually, certainly in the sensitive sectors, who cares about textiles, right? But in the sensitive sectors, I think actually the pressure will, if anything, increase.
Okay. All right. So now we've come to the conflict, heightening tensions. I want to turn to a question that I saw the most number of times from the audience so far, and that is about geopolitics, military capabilities, and Taiwan. So, Josh, I'm going to turn to you next. With China increasing its military capabilities, becoming more vocal about Taiwan, we've had a lot of questions from the audience on this, but what are the scenarios for Taiwan?
Well, it's funny you should mention Taiwan, especially right after the question that Michael answered so intelligently, because I was actually just looking at news today that Morris Chang, who's the founder of TSMC, which is Taiwan's semiconductor company, which is the world's largest and most dominant and most important semiconductor company manufacturer. He was in Arizona for the opening of a plant there. Joe Biden was also there, big ceremony. I can't remember how much they're spending on it, $40 billion or something. That plant is TSMC's investment in that plant is all about decoupling, right? China has been very eager for TSMC to open chip fabs and factories in the US, because it is worried about, I think, partially what China might do with Taiwan, and TSMC is just so vital to the entire tech supply chain and global economy in some ways. And one of the thing that Morris Chang said at this that really struck out is globalization. There's a quote: "Globalization is almost dead, and free trade is almost dead." A lot of people still wish they would come back, but I don't think they will be back. Right. So it was a really bleak view from the founder
very
of
bleak.
Taiwan's.
Yes.
Yeah. But turning to Taiwan itself, I mean, I think there are probably 4 scenarios facing Taiwan right now. And of course, for just background for anyone who hasn't been following, of course, China claims Taiwan as part of its territory, and Xi Jinping has really made the reclaiming of Taiwan or the claiming of Taiwan a sort of central part of his kind of nationalist platform, the China dream, right? That's his central idea, is returning China to its former glory, and recovering Taiwan is a huge part of that. And it's something that he says that he does not want to leave to the next generation to accomplish. So there's a certain urgency, a certain, that's the kind of background. And so the scenarios, I think, for Taiwan, one scenario which seems extremely unlikely, is that the U.S. and its allies and Taiwan itself are able to build up a credible enough deterrent, or able to persuade Xi Jinping to just give that up, right? To just that China will sort of stop talking about it, will stop threatening any of that. I mean, that's a scenario. It's the least likely scenario.
Yeah.
Another scenario that a lot of people talk about but also seems unlikely, at least when you talk to political analysts and military analysts, is that China would invade Taiwan in the near term. There's a few reasons that's unlikely. One is just that the main one is that it's an extremely difficult thing to do. And a lot of military analysts don't think that the People's Liberation Army, China's military, is necessarily up to it yet. I mean, they've been building up to it, and there's certainly that is the kind of their main focus. But there's a lot of doubt about whether the PLA can do that. I mean, this is a military that hasn't fought a war since the late 1970s. That was a border war against Vietnam, which they lost. And so there are just very few soldiers or officers or anyone in the Chinese military that's had that experience. And an invasion of Taiwan is actually militarily very, very difficult, because you have to cross the Taiwan Strait, which is a really, really choppy body of water, and do an amphibious landing, which just be incredibly difficult. So there's another scenario, is that China could, which is perhaps more likely, is that China could, rather than invade Taiwan, just blockade it and put pressure on it that way. And this is something that people have been talking about a lot more since Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan earlier this year and created a huge stir. China reacted really strongly, as a lot of people expected, and what it did was simulate a blockade. And I think after they did that, it sort of became, people before that had sort of been fixated on this idea of an invasion. I think now more and more people are talking about what will happen if China doesn't invade but just blocks Taiwan off, which could have, I think they could cut Taiwan's economy off in some really serious ways and really put a lot of pressure without actually invading. And then the other scenario, which is also, has a higher probability, is just the status quo, right? It's just that we kind of keep doing what we're doing now. There's a lot of maneuvering on either side, and there's a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty on both sides, which sort of keeps anyone from making a move. And it's really hard. I mean, it's really hard to sort of say exactly what's going to happen, or who would set it off, right? I mean, I think there's, it could be either side. China is really on guard right now against signs that Taiwan might seek independence. They're really worried about increased U.S. support for Taiwan. But you could have, often what happens in these scenarios is you have an accident, right? You have 2 planes colliding or 2 ships colliding, and then things build from there. And I think that's probably one of the scenarios that people think is most likely. But yeah.
That was the other question that I got the most from the
I
audience, which is
say something
who would
quickly on
trigger.
that one? I
Yes,
think actually,
yes,
the
Michael, go
one on the
ahead.
blockade, because people are very worried about that, but it's worth remembering that in the last 200 years, no blockade has actually succeeded in actually getting any country to surrender its sovereignty. And the most comprehensive blockade actually in recent memory was that of Japan by the United States, which blocked Japanese imports by 97%. But it's not that Japan rolled over, right? So
Okay,
I think the efficacy of a blockade should not be overestimated. So
do you have any thoughts on which of the 4 scenarios, or do you have a 5th one?
I think these are the most likely scenarios. So I fully agree with Josh, in particular also on the idea that, trying to conquer Taiwan, good luck with that, right? I mean, there's, just to give you another example, not only is there a big body of water you need to cross with tens and tens of thousands of people, but there's only 13 beaches in Taiwan that are actually suitable for an amphibious landing. So, I mean, the People's Liberation Army can destroy Taiwan, but conquering Taiwan is a different matter.
Okay, so all these scenarios, I want to go back to Josh and talk about a slightly different topic, but also on this geopolitics, which is China's having built the world's most advanced state surveillance system, and now they're starting to export it. So how does that affect the relationship with the US?
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, it seems kind of like a sort of bit of a pivot conversationally, but actually there are some connections. There are some connections between China's surveillance state and all these issues we've been discussing, particularly the chip restrictions, right? And so just to back up a little bit, China has built up what is, I think now most people realize is the world's most advanced surveillance state. They've really made surveillance and the use of cutting edge tracking technologies and harvesting and analysis of data a sort of central part of their governance model. And the idea basically, the theory behind it is that if you collect enough data on people and you have the right tools, you can sort of engineer society. You can kind of manipulate people and predict their desires, shape their desires in some ways. And as a result of the Communist Party's interest in this method of governance, they've invested a ton of money in surveillance companies, including Huawei. There's a Hikvision, which is the world's largest camera maker, is Chinese. The world's second largest camera maker, Dahua, also Chinese. And these companies are all, I mean, like any companies, they are very interested in expanding globally, which they do. And what's unique though is because the Chinese government is so invested in these technologies itself, it's also helping them export technologies, going beyond what governments usually do, I think, to sort of promote those exports. And to the US, this is I think this does present in the eyes of some people a real threat to democracy, in the sense that China's kind of putting forth this new model of governance that is attractive to a lot of other governments around the world. They're essentially going, especially in the developing world, they're going around to various governments and selling these systems quite cheaply as ways to sort of maintain control, social control, without having to deal with the messiness of democracy and elections and all of that sort of stuff. And so that is I think the US does see that as a problem. And it is one of the reasons that they mention when they talk about when they explain why they are restricting China's ability to access US chip technology. I mean, the other part of it is military, which relates to Taiwan, but there's also this sort of more like abstract ideological motivation that China is using American technology to build a system that is sort of fundamentally opposed or competitive with, or wants to be competitive with American democracy.
But it also shows how interrelated the two countries are then. If China is using US technology, building its own surveillance system, and now they're decoupling and they're selling each their own technologies. Michael, do you have anything to add to this?
I have many thoughts about this, and basically I will be parsimonious on this. So it's true. I mean, we're talking about a surveillance society, which of course has benefits for the Communist Party. It creates another friction point, right? Because essentially you're seeing people always saying the current situation is not like the Cold War. There are no ideological differences. There are huge ideological differences. A controlled society as opposed to, well, whatever freedom means, right? This is kind of a loaded term, right? But let's just say Western societies essentially, you know, take the lid off a little more, and it gets messy, and sometimes it gets really unruly. But these are very, very kind of different ideologies in terms of how should the world look like. And I think it's not to be underestimated how much this actually also shapes the current conflict, in particular in the context of Washington, Beijing.
Okay. All right. We want to get to the next part, which is what should we make of all of this? So we have established there huge tensions increasing between the US and China, both economically, militarily, geopolitically. So we're outside the US, we're outside of China. What does it mean for us? I wanted to ask Josh about Asia, and then I want to go to Michael about Europe. So Josh, can you tell us, you know, how will the rest of Asia be impacted by these higher tensions?
Oh, I'm glad I got the nice, narrow, easy question. I think, you know, if you sort of look at the history of how the rest of Asia has approached US-China relations, it's always been about the view has always been, we just hope it doesn't screw things up for us, right? We just hope the US and China can get along well enough that they don't drag us in to their fights, and you know, things can be stable enough that we can continue to sort of thrive and just do our thing. I think that's been the driving motivation for most Southeast Asian governments for a long time, and I think that's still the case for the vast majority of countries. And you know, every country in Southeast Asia is kind of closer to one or the other power. A lot of them are very economically extremely closely tied to China and essentially cannot decouple from China. So they're really reliant on China, but they might be reliant on the US for security. I think the one really interesting country in all of this is India. You know, India has a very contentious relationship with China, and it's gotten more tense recently, particularly over border issues. They've had some violence along their shared border. There's been a lot of suspicion of Chinese companies, tech companies, in India, and India has joined with Australia and the US and Japan in a sort of kind of informal security alliance that's aimed at curbing China in the Asia Pacific region. Although, you know, typical of India, it's also kind of sided with China and Moscow a little bit on the Ukraine, or at least has been conspicuously absent from that debate. So it's a complicated country and a bit of a wild card. And I think a lot of Asia's, you know, if you're talking about the reactions in Asia, probably India is the most important country to watch.
Okay. All right, great. And Michael, I was gonna just simply ask you, what does it mean for Europe? But I do have an audience question that phrases it a slightly different way. Should the EU follow the US's lead and try itself to decouple more from China?
So I think to answer that question, it's useful to take a step back, right? And essentially ask what is really going on here right now. And I think a very popular interpretation in Europe, but an incorrect interpretation in Europe, is that this is a fight between China and the US that Europe can stay out of. I think actually it's also true that if Asian nations basically think it's like, okay, we're going to keep our heads down and we will not be involved, they're also wrong, right? When the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled, okay? And, you know, while, I mean, Europe is the grass, okay? It's part of the grass.
Okay, all right.
So in the end, if you basically look at the larger picture, what we're seeing is potentially, you know, a period of what in political science we would call power transition. Namely, the decline of one hegemon, so one superpower loses power relative to another. And in my mind, there's very little doubt that essentially China aspires to being the global superpower in the future. Whether it's possible to do that, that's a different story, but certainly at a minimum would like to become a regional superpower, and that has great implications for Asia. So the more powerful China actually gets, the more influence it will have on shaping the rest of the world. The rules of the game, and so on and so forth. And the really interesting question, the key question that the Europeans need to ask themselves is basically this. What kind of set of rules would they rather play by?
Mm-hmm.
Would they, so they may have misgivings about the Americans, and there's plenty of reasons why you might actually complain about America. And basically you could say, you know, they've done so many bad things, they have been hypocritical, and so on and so forth. That's actually true for the entire West. I think in general, there's a lot of hypocrisy going on there, basically. But then at the same time, you know, the comparison point is not some kind of nice abstract ideal of, you know, what would the best possible world look like, but what would the world look like with an ever stronger China, right? And in this context, with a world in which Europe more and more depends actually on China. And I'm not saying it's interdependent, but I'm literally saying depends, because that's, for instance, a discussion in Germany right now. If anything goes wrong in China, let's say with Taiwan, for instance, German companies are going to lose big. And the politicians are telling them correctly, you know, guys, you need to not decouple in the sense of completely kind of tear things apart, but you need to reduce things. So there needs to be a decoupling process here, right? So that we don't have the same mess as we had with Russia, where we had huge dependency on gas. So in my view, it is very, very clear that I would prefer the US-style approach to running the world to the Chinese approach to running the world. Right? There might be some people who disagree, but anyway, you know, you ask me what do I think? So in this particular case, to the extent that Europeans arrive at the same conclusion, they need to realize this is also their fight. And that
so that they should.
means
So you think they should start to decouple?
That means that if you're worried about what the rise of China actually means for the shape of the world order, which is one of our topics, so you compare the world order you've had so far with the likely world order in the future. Choose which you prefer. If the answer is that actually this one has been pretty good, we're not so sure this one will be all that great, then the answer is you will probably be better off going with the Americans than with the Chinese. That would be my
Okay, thank you for that. All right, we have a lot of audience questions coming in, so I think we will turn to that for now. Josh, there is a question for you personally in your stories. In your stories, you talk about China versus Western countries. And what are the Western countries that you're talking about? The specific one for you, Josh.
I mean, I think, you know, I was like any journalist, especially for a daily newspaper, I often, unfortunately, rely on shorthand because I have a limited number of words in which to write my stories. You know, I mean, I think you know, anyone who uses the West, it is shorthand for sort of the kind of advanced liberal democracies in the world, right? The wealthy liberal democracies, and of course it's imperfect, right? Because it also increasingly includes Japan, South Korea, and other countries that are not in the West. But yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, the United States, Europe, Canada, Japan, South Korea, those, you know, countries that sort of have liberal democratic systems, market economies, and yeah. You know, those are, and increasingly, I think it is starting to come, you know, that division or some sort of global division is coming more and more into focus, I think, now because of the conflict between China and the US. I think there was, you know, it is becoming, I think, increasingly clear to a lot of people in both countries, in China as well as in democratic countries, exactly what the differences are. It's becoming starker now.
Okay. Okay. Now we have a question from Michael on there are two questions regarding Ukraine. So the war in Ukraine has widened the rift between the US and China. Can you take us through this? That's one. But also there was another question from another person in the audience saying, how does the heightened tensions between US and China affect the Ukraine war? So both sides.
Okay, so there are a number of ways of kind of tackling this, and you know, and potentially, let's see, we have 15 minutes left. Let's see what short answer I can give you. So one interpretation is essentially that we have seen the emergence of an alliance between Russia and China. Now, people have a lot of debate about, you know, how much of an alliance is this really, how strong is it, and so on and so forth, right? But certainly there seems to be some alignment in terms of how they both think the world should be run. And certainly they seem to be aligned in the idea that it should not be determined by the United States. Let me perhaps put it this way. So if we now basically look at the power dynamics between this kind of alliance and the West, what we actually see is, because of China's massive investments in military infrastructure, and also because of Russian massive investments in infrastructure and in its militaries, we have actually seen that the balance of power, as it is called, is actually shifting away from the West and from the United States. I'll actually show you this basically, because this sounds all very very abstract. I happen to have a slide on that. I didn't know this was coming, right? But you know, basically, it's good to be forearmed. Let me give you a sense here what the situation looks like, and then I'll say briefly why this matters. So what you see here is basically the ratio of military spending. So first of all, the blue line is, let's start with the blue line, is the ratio of US over Chinese military spending and purchasing power parity. Translation price differences are, to the extent possible, taken out of it, and I also took out inflation. And essentially what you see is, and this is just one indicator of the balance of power here, is that China has been gaining relative power on the United States. Why? Because basically they're investing massively in the military. Now, this is actually the line for Russia. And you can see that similarly, actually, Russia has been trying to get closer to what the United States is spending on this whole thing. Of course, Russia can never get anywhere close to that because the Russian economy is smaller than Germany's, right? So basically, Russia trying to be a world power is a joke. The only reason why it is actually a halfway meaningful player is because of its 6,000 nuclear warheads, but economically speaking, it really doesn't have the power to be a big player. China does, but if you then put both of them together, essentially this can be read as a challenge to, in particular, US hegemony. And if you, and essentially there's a school of thought in international relations theory that fundamentally argues, when these things basically happen, at some point, the challengers, the guys who have been gaining strength, feel that they're strong enough to start kind of really challenging the ability of the ruling hegemon, in this case, the United States, to maintain order. So the shorthand is usually, if somebody catches up at some point, there will be some kind of conflict, which in most cases in history was a war. In this case, you could argue China plus Russia has been catching up on the United States militarily, and potentially, this was part of the equation when Putin decided that the West is not going to put up much of resistance. So actually, you know, China has a role in encouraging, in my view, or enabling Russia to actually go ahead with this a little adventure, which of course has been enormously costly, especially for the Ukrainians, but also for the Russians. China also has, in my view, a decent amount of influence and power to kind of perhaps guide the process from here, but it's not exerting that influence at all. And I think part of that is because they don't want to undermine somebody that they see as a very, very important ally, namely Vladimir Putin. And certainly a democratic Russia, if it were to happen, if Putin were overthrown, first of all, we should always leave open the possibility that whoever comes after Putin could be worse. But let's say, you know, we might actually have a revolution or an overthrow, a coup, and Putin basically loses power. We have a democratic Russia, one that is more Western oriented, that would distinctly not be in the interest of China. So the fact that we're not seeing China really pushing all that much against what is going on in Ukraine is very much a function of Russia looking at its own power, China looking at its own power relative to the United States and needing Russia in this context. Is one interpretation. I think there's probably something to that, but if we say more about that, then it will be taking a couple more hours.
Okay. Okay, thank you for all that. All right. So now we've discussed, I have a, but on the other hand kind of question, and I'm going to ask both of you, starting with Josh, but we've talked about how the grass is being trampled by the elephants, everybody is affected, the tensions are heightening, but is there somebody, either a country or a company, a businesses or countries that are actually standing to gain from the rising tensions? You know, I suppose if companies get out of China, maybe there's another country where there are more people going in, or are there any businesses that stand to gain from all this? Josh, I'll start with you.
Well, playing off of Michael's amazingly well-timed chart, I would vote for defense contractors. I mean, I joke, but I think that's, you know, that's absolutely where we are. I mean, and you know, just as during the Cold War, I mean, I think this is going to be a boon for all companies that and industries that are sort of connected to that, to the military and to sort of great power competition. You know, it is a really, you know, it is kind of fascinating to look at which companies in the US might, you know, are actually being hurt in all of this, or, you know, I mean, in the sense, like, the US is actually potentially doing a lot of damage to its own tech industry, right? And I think, you know, so it is really interesting to think about which companies may benefit. But I think one of the striking things to me in all of this is that the US is willing to cut off its tech industry from China, particularly the chip industry, because I do think that is it's a really striking statement about priorities. And so, yeah, I'm sure there are other companies that will benefit from this, but I feel like in the short to medium term, a lot of companies are going to struggle. But Michael probably has a much better answer on that.
Well, let's see about that. But actually, I think what you just mentioned illustrates one principle that's very important, but I think little appreciated. Namely, when we're in a period of great power competition, essentially politics is no longer about absolute gains. Politics is basically about relative gains. And essentially, the United States, so the restrictions on the chips are essentially predicated on the notion that it will hurt me, but it will hurt you more, right? And given the logic of relative power that I alluded to just in the comment on Ukraine, that is actually then a win for the United States, even if in absolute terms it loses. But to answer your question, Yumiko, I'll go to countries, okay? Josh basically was talking about companies. I'll go to countries. So first of all, one thing that we'll see more of in industries that are strategically important, what we'll see more of is a phenomenon called friendshoring. Right, so we've heard of offshoring, we've heard of reshoring. There is now a new trend, basically, at least an emerging trend of friendshoring. So you need to figure out which are going to be, you know, the countries that will be on friendly terms with the home country, and that's where you can actually potentially put some of these sensitive industries. There could also be winners among countries that are not clearly in either bloc. And actually India would be in a good position. I'm not sure India is playing the game all that well, as Josh has pointed out, right? Because, you know, if you need Americans against China, then basically, in a sense, remaining aligned with Russia doesn't particularly help the Indian case. But in principle, if you have countries that are not clearly in either camp, but that both sides would actually like to win over, it gives them the opportunity to play off the two sides against each other. And that actually then could be quite interesting. So maybe some more investments through the Belt and Road Initiative, you know, and then you go to the Americans and you say, well, look, you know, we don't want to be too close to the Chinese. Maybe you can actually help us a little bit with our investments or things like that. I think there's plenty of scope for countries that are literally in between to gain from this particular scenario.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually, I was just sorry, quickly on that, just to follow up on that, Yumiko, with to shamelessly promote Wall Street Journal reporting. You know, we recently had a story about Apple moving to and telling its suppliers that it is going to be moving more and more of its production outside of China, and this is partially. You know, partially a response to a lot of worker unrest at its main plant in China, but also a response to U.S.-China tensions. And Apple is the world's most successful and biggest and most influential technology company. So when they move, a lot of things happen. And one of the countries they identified as Vietnam, and then a few other countries in Asia. So any companies that do that are sort of in the tech supply chains for companies like Apple that are trying to diversify from China are probably gonna do well out of this generally.
Okay. We're sort of running out of time, but I do want to get to this question is, we talked about how the tensions are heightening and things are probably going to go, Michael, you were talking about how it's probably going to continue to decouple, but is there anything that could help improve the relationship? Because after all, I mean, there's been years and years of US dominance, and isn't it better not to just have the US, but to have a strong competitor like China? Isn't it better to have better relationships between the two countries? And is there anything that could make that happen?
Okay, so economically speaking, the answer would be yes, of course, collaboration would be great, right? But if we now go back to, again, theory in terms of how countries get or don't get along with each other, we can actually derive a couple of possibilities out of that. I think the clearest way that actually things could turn around is if Xi Jinping lost power and China democratized.
Oh,
this is clearly covered basically by theory, right? This is called the theory of democratic peace. There is not a single documented case in history of two truly democratic countries actually having a war with each other. So in that particular case, they might actually, it might not be easy, but certainly, the edge would be taken off, and I would be willing to bet a decent amount of money that we would not end up in a war. So that possibility exists. So for instance, a regime change in China, followed by democratization, which, by the way, that was the American bet, right? Why did America not contain China in the 1990s? And the answer is because basically the choice was either prevent China from growing altogether, or we engage. Yes, we make money. Okay, fair enough, right? But we engage, but hopefully through the development of the economy, you'll see the rise of the middle class, democratization. And in the end, you can actually then hopefully work with somebody who's very big, very powerful, but also democratic. So the bet was actually, this is where China would be going. As you know, that bet hasn't really worked out. But that's one alternative scenario that would actually lead to a different outcome. Maybe Josh, other scenario?
That's one scenario, but it's a pretty extreme scenario. Josh, do you have? I mean, could there be other possibilities or scenarios where the two countries' relationships might improve?
I mean, one thing I've learned in covering China and China and the US is you never say never. However, I do think, speaking to Michael's point, that certainly was, he's absolutely right. That was the American strategy, right? And it is, I think, unambiguously, most people now believe that strategy was wrong or it failed for whatever reason. One thing I think to think about with China democratizing at some point, and that is that, one thing that Xi Jinping has done methodically since he got into power is dismantle civil society and dismantle any sort of other organizational capacity in Chinese society that could rival the Communist Party. And so if you look at countries like Taiwan, other countries in Asia that transferred from authoritarian governments to democratic governments, so Taiwan and South Korea are the two biggest examples. Both of those had really robust civil societies at the time of their transition, and so when the authoritarian governments fell, there was something to take its place, and you just don't have that in China. And you saw that with the protests over COVID. They flared up, but then they petered out really quickly. And one theory about why that happened is there just wasn't enough alternative social structure in China to sustain those protests. So I think that the prospects for democratic China are pretty slim. And then also, sorry to be negative. I mean, I'm a reporter, so hopefully I can be forgiven. But I think, it is really remarkable the level of agreement, of bipartisan agreement in Washington on China right now. And just recently, you had Matt Pottinger, who was a senior member of Trump's National Security Council, who was an architect of the Trump-China policy, agreeing with Joe Biden's
So
chip.
it unified the US that.
So you have a
Okay.
former Trump official praising Joe Biden. So I think in neither country do you see signs that are realistic signs of this of sort
Okay.
of
So
reversal.
it's going to
But
be
Yumiko,
challenging anyway.
let me perhaps
All right.
let me give you very, very just
We
kind
are
of
running out of time, Michael, but if you have a very quick point.
the generic answer is basically number one, either all of these friction points need to disappear for things to get better, in particular the big ones such as Taiwan, and or China needs to grow like crazy. Those would be the two main levers for actually decoupling, perhaps not to happen.
Okay.
Likelihood of that probably not that big.
Okay, well, thank you so much. This has been a very large discussion going on economy, geopolitics, and the implications for the rest of the world. Thank you so much to both panelists for participating. Thank you to all of you in the audience. If you're an alumni of INSEAD, you'll have more events coming up. And I want to thank you again for participating today.